is somebody most of you know, because he's been here. April 9th, I think, was the date of his first presentation. He has a doctorate. He was a Wilson Scholar. He's a professor of economics. He's all those things that I think we've talked about before. And welcome, Parvez.
Thank you, Bob.
I think we're going to start with some slides, and then what we'll do after that is almost immediately open up to dialogue. We'll just chat, Q&A from the floor.
Will do. So thank you for inviting me back. I don't want this to be a classroom session, although in a PowerPoint and a professor, it's like a bad combination over here. But I'll walk you through a few slides just to kind of frame the conversation. And from that framing, we can then take it anywhere you wish to go with that, or whichever direction, Bob, you want to go with it. I'm going to start by reading you a short excerpt from a book that I'm going to suggest as one of recommended readings based on the topic on which I'm speaking to you today. It's a book by a well-known researcher and author. Her name is Heather McGhee. The title of the book is The Sum of Us. And in the ending of the book, she writes this. She raises an interesting question. This moment is challenging us finally to settle this question. Who is an American, and what are we to one another? Who is an American, and what are we to one another? And everything, in my view, depends on how we answer this question. So with that framing, let me walk you through a few quick slides to talk about wealth inequality.
We're not on the screen yet.
Oh, we're not on the screen?
Josh, are you there? We need to connect to the screen. Is it you?
Let me see.
Here we go. There we go.
Okay, let's see. There we go, thanks. So, on this slide, what we are seeing is how our national income is shared by different Americans. In the 1980s, the bottom 50% shared almost 23% of our national income. And the top 1% got about 7 or 8% of the national income. 2016 is when this data ends, but 2020 data is not going to be that much different, as the trend lines are unmistakable. So then over the next 30, 40 years, 4 decades, what has happened? The entire picture is flipped. People at the very top of the income scale, of the wealth scale, own the top 1%, own over 20% of the national income, and the bottom 50% own about 12, 13% of the national income. And this picture, you can slice it whichever way you want. I showed you 2 different studies, one from, I think this was from a WHO source, the other is from Pew Studies, and the picture pretty much stays the same. That over time, the wealth share of the upper income, top 1%, top 10%, whichever way you want to slice the data, has continued to grow, while the middle income has continued to slide down, and the lower income level has pretty much been flat over the last 30, 40 years. So what I make the case over here is that when we think about issues like poverty, gender discrimination, racial discrimination, we often frame these issues as moral problems, if we acknowledge that these are problems. But if we do acknowledge that these are problems in society, then we frame them as moral problems. As an economist, I also frame them as economical problems, as simply money problems. And because of these problems, collectively, we are all worse off. Again, goes back to the question, who are we? in our definition of we, who do we count as being us, and who do we count as being the other? If the we is the collective we, the American people, 360 million of us, in different shades and color, different religions, different languages, all sharing one goal, a belief in the creed of we the people, then we can see that the cost is borne by everybody when we leave moral problems unaddressed. So for example, child poverty costs us, we can tangibly calculate this as economists, costs the country $1 trillion every year. Gender and racial wage gaps cost us $2.6 trillion in lost wages and earnings. The Trump tax cuts cost us $1.3 trillion in government revenue. And much of that tax cut was then used by corporations who were the primary beneficiaries of this tax cut to essentially buy back their own stock, close to $1 trillion in stock buybacks. The forever wars that we have seen for the last 2+ decades now has already cost us $6.4 trillion. Inaction on climate change is going to cost us $4.8 trillion a year, double the GDP losses caused by the pandemic. Preventable deaths from poverty and inequality adds up to 250,000 lost lives every year. Preventable. The cumulative financial cost of the pandemic is close to $16 trillion. And I've shown you the citation. These are not numbers I calculated, I'm just referencing other people's work. So when we look at this, then we ask the question, what are the issues? Like how do we see the wealth inequality, and what is our thesis? And one of the theses, among the many, you can provide different explanations to why this wealth inequality exists. But one of the thesis that you can say proponents of critical race theory puts out, not just critical race theory people, but also other theorists puts out, economists like us who like to look at system-wide issues, and that's what most economists study. What are the issues system-wide? We can point to certain actions that we took as a country that at the time looked like a good idea, what would be considered a race-neutral idea, but in the long run, it only made wealth disparities worse. And there are several examples of that. For example, the Social Security Act of 1935. It excluded agricultural workers and domestic servants, who were primarily black and brown. The Wagner Act of 1935. It gave unions the power for collective bargaining, but allowed unions to exclude non-whites. GI Bill of 1944. It was left to the states to administer it, and many states administered it in a very discriminatory way. The Federal Housing Administration that was created in 1934, it instituted the neighborhood appraisal system that effectively tied mortgages to race, entire neighborhoods, the whole idea of redlining. The Federal Highway Aid Act of 1956, it often built highways that cut through black communities, often separating them from and isolated them from major population centers, from major economic centers. And so it does not surprise most economists when we see a picture like this. When we take the general inequality in wealth that I first showed you and ask the question, does it extend to racial inequalities in wealth? Are there significant differences between the wealth of black people and white people? I'm only looking at black and white. We can include other subgroups in this conversation, and the general thesis will remain the same. And what we see again is that from 1980s to this point forward, wealth inequality is worsening as we go through time. So today, the difference between the median wealth of a black family and the median wealth of a white family is between 8 to 10 times. Same picture. I'm going to quickly go through this slide to just point out the same picture. Now this picture shows you that in the 30s and 40s, the difference between white and black wealth was 3 to 4 times. Even through segregation, it was 5 to 6 times. It is close to 7 to 10 times now. So the further we have gone, as the picture, clear as the picture is 1,000 words, the lines are diverging as we go forward in time. And that story repeats. What is perhaps even more significant when we see this slide is that typically we have made the argument that education is the great equalizer, except it isn't. That disparities between white and black wealth persist even for people who are holding advanced degrees. And the same story repeats. Whichever way you slice the data, we look at ownership of homes and businesses, and we look at ownerships in stocks and investment securities, and the story persists. We look at household income, and we look at household income from the top 10%. So the people who are wealthy, who are in the top 10%, which is the slide, which is the graph at the bar at the very, very right. So these are wealthy people. People at the top end of the wealth scale. But there's a significant difference between white people and black people at the top end of the wealth scale as it is on the bottom. In fact, the disparity worsens as one moves up the wealth scale. And the picture, again, as I said, whichever way we look at the picture stays the same. This picture is slicing the same data by age. So when people are in their teens and in their mid-30s, the wealth gap, white-black wealth gap is smaller. As they age, the white-black wealth gap becomes bigger and bigger. The same story repeats again. I can go through this through other data. A couple of last slides I want to show you just to give you one example, tangible example. And one of the cities noted over here is Jacksonville, because it is so Jacksonville-centric. This is an interesting data. It shows that neighborhoods that are primarily black are on average about 10 degrees hotter than neighborhoods that are primarily white. It would not surprise you if you travel to west side and north side of the city. You don't have a whole lot of green spaces, not a whole lot of trees, not a whole lot of parks. So the temperature difference. Now, you can say, well, it's just 10 degrees. Well, but that leads to disease. That leads to lost income. That leads to lost educational opportunities. So all of these have a cascading effect. It is not just the statistics, it has real impact on people's lives. Who owns wealth in America? White people make up 60% of the population, but own 86% of the national wealth. And again, the same data we can look at other ways. I'm going to end with this because this can spark the conversation. So I'm going to end with this. As I gave you a little bit of a treatment on what the problem is, as I see it as an economist, I also want to posit things that are solutions to these problems. And what is often talked about is that we look at public policy because of persistent inequalities in our history and our present. We look at public policy through a slightly different lens. And we become conscious of the fact that these inequalities exist. And so when we posit solutions, we come up with solutions that ultimately address the growing inequality. Because that growing inequality is simply not sustainable. It's simply not sustainable for society. It has, as I mentioned in the second or the third slide, it has a cost. It can be quantified, a quantifiable cost on all of us. So what do I mean by that? What is meant by race-conscious policies? One of the most, perhaps the most, arguably the most controversial of race-conscious policies is reparations. Repair the harm that has been done in the past. Morally, you can make an argument for it, but even as a person who morally can make an argument for it, as an economist, I struggle with its implementation. How do you implement a reparations program? So let's hold that thought. The other things that have been posited, why don't we provide things like baby bonds? When a child is born, the government gives them a bond. It's a savings program, and that is scaled by income. So that people who are at the bottom end of the income scale, they can slowly catch up. And the wealth gap begins to reduce as we all go through time. Something that is here and now. The recent American Rescue Plan that was passed has a provision in it for child tax credit, a $300 child tax credit. That is a race-conscious policy, because most of the people who will receive that income will be disproportionately, as a proportion of the income, a proportion of the population, would be helping people who are black and brown. And will cut childhood poverty by half. Just that one $300 child tax credit. Imagine if that can be sustained. It's a one-year program right now under the rescue plan. Hopefully it becomes a permanent feature down the road. Other states are already experimenting with it. States like Texas, not my favorite, although I graduated from UT Arlington, not my favorite state in terms of its politics. But even a state like Texas is experimenting with things like guaranteeing admissions to the top 10% students in each school, not tying it to a standardized test score, but tying it to the performance of the students in their own schools. And the state universities are guaranteeing admissions for those students. Is going to lift a whole lot of people at the bottom end who would otherwise not have access to these educational opportunities. And there are a bunch of other things, increasing minimum wage, addressing climate change through environmental justice programs. When you look at climate change, don't not just look at climate change in terms of resiliency, but also look at climate change in terms of toxic dumps and neighborhoods that are close to toxic dumps. How does it impact their health? How does it impact their well-being going forward? So that's what I want to kind of leave open as a teaser. Then let the sparks fly.
It's a lot of teas. If I may, I'll just comment on a couple of things. The one that, just a small thought that went through, you talked about the Texas policy of guaranteed admissions for the top 10% in that particular school. Years ago, I hired a young woman from Mississippi State she ended up being a vice president for Latin America. She was summa cum laude at Mississippi State, and in the top 2 or 3% of her class. And people ask, why did you hire somebody from a school that's not very well known, certainly not very well known for executives in the power industry, when there are candidates from all of these other better known schools? And it was the same argument.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather have somebody who's the top in their environment, in their community, than somebody who was middle in a bigger, broader, grander place. It's the same concept.
Same concept.
And it worked out, by the way, extremely well. There's a lot here to talk about. Maybe we can move this. Would you want to leave the slide on, or do you want?
No, we can take it down.
Maybe just mention these 3 books.
Yeah, these are 3 recommended readings that I have used in recent times. I'm using them in my classrooms, actually, 2 of them. Some of Us and Color of Money, I'm using in my classrooms to talk about racial inequality of wealth. Just leave it as that there as recommended readings if you want to further, because obviously the topic is much more complicated and it will certainly not lend itself to a short conversation.
And I'd add to those 3 a book called Color of Law
Color of Law is the companion book to Color of Money.
which looks at the set of legal provisions that dominated our housing industry for so long. Okay, if you want to put the screen up, then we can focus more on us and the audience. We've got a couple of questions. We'll start with Charlie.
Could you leave that down? Would you put the last slide up, please?
Oh, you put the last slide up?
Yeah, which is your solutions, what you want to see done. Is that on? Can you hear me?
Hey, Janice? Now they're going to have the last slide up.
I want to ask you a question, but
Hold on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Well, the mics go out, the screens move. The mic will be on when the screen is moving. Hello, hello. When the screen is moving, the mics go off.
Is that better?
Won't be for a minute, wait. Organize your thoughts.
I got my thoughts. Well, I don't think. Can you hear me or not?
The microphones will start working after the screen comes down.
Oh, okay.
This is the slide you want?
Yes.
Excellent.
May I ask a question before the screen comes down? Is this curriculum that you presented, is this taught in colleges?
Now it's on. Is it on now?
Is this what I presented? Is it taught in colleges? In my classroom, yes. I'm teaching this in my classroom.
You teach it at North Florida?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, thank you for coming back.
Sure.
We appreciate the views that you present. Bob, thank you for arranging this to happen. I was looking at this list here and determining, is this, you're talking about race. If we're talking about a black person who is not born into wealth or whatever, into poverty, my question in my mind is this the best way for a child to grow up to be a man or a woman? By receiving all of these things from birth. The other question I have is, it's dealing with the tax credits, permanent making child tax credits. What about the proportion of children that are born to different races? For example, in New York City, where I grew up, there's a fairly good percentage of minorities, blacks. There's also, and this is nothing new, but there are blacks, children born with a father that's no longer there. Credits are received, we get the Social Security, we get different kinds of benefits for child support. The more children you have, the more you get. And this becomes, for many people, a way of life. This is the way to exist. And I question that as to whether your solutions are really for the best growth of the black person.
The solutions I'm presenting are, if you don't like them, you can propose other solutions. This is neither an exhaustive list, nor a comprehensive list, nor these are the only things that can be possible. What I'm proposing and what I'm showing in these solutions is that there are existing solutions, there are proposed solutions that would end up, if administered well, like the child tax credit. One of the qualifiers I would put on that is if it is administered well, then it would end up cutting childhood poverty by half. And since we know a disproportionate amount of people in childhood poverty are black and brown, so when childhood poverty is cut by half, that population is going to get lifted. That's all I'm saying, is that I'm not saying this is the only way. If there are other solutions, as an economist, as an academic, I will never turn down a good idea. I will listen to the idea. So if there are other solutions, I said bring it on.
We're going to go to Forrest next, but let me just throw out one thought. It's so easy to say, oh my goodness, if you give these people money, these people, by the way, they'll have more children. Well, it's the opposite of that. I guess if we just starve them and don't give them any money, they won't have any children. Maybe that'll solve the problem. Or maybe the children will be so poor and not have food, they'll just die. That can solve the problem. In other words, the opposite is obviously silly. And while I respect the question, and the old AF, what was it, the aid to the mothers of dependent children, I can't remember what the acronym was, but everybody said that's just encouraging those people to have more children. Well, the alternative isn't a very attractive alternative. Forrest?
I'm going to stand up because lots of people say I'm not easily heard. I appreciate you being here, and Bob, I always appreciate your getting us all together. But I have some major concerns about your barriers to wealth, and I'd ask Josh if he would put that back up.
Which one?
Barriers to wealth. Barriers to wealth.
There you go.
There you go. That's fine. Thank you. The act you were just speaking about, Bob, is the Aid for Families with Dependent Children.
FDC, that's right.
1956, Lyndon Johnson. I feel like if you take all of these permits, every single one of them, except the last one, were under Democratic administrations. The last one of which is the interstate highways system, which we obviously spent a lot of money on, but I believe we got much greater benefit than cost. And I recognize that you're right, that they come off through black neighborhoods with close to urban centers, which were designed to be connected. But I think it's just unfortunate that Charlie is talking about it, and I'm glad he brought it up. But the Aid for Families for Dependent Children, I would argue, is the greatest barrier to wealth in my lifetime. And the reason it is really simple. It basically took the black father out of the black home. At that time, we had about 30% unwed mothers in this country in the black communities. And today we have about 70%. Well, anybody that's done it, I'm sure you've done some economic studies. The worst family formation as far as economic circumstance is a single mother with a dependent child. And it to me ought to be headlined up here, not the other things that were, all but one of which was under Democratic administrations, as was the Johnson Act in '56.
Do you want to answer that or speak to that at all for a bit?
I'm not sure there's a question in it, so I'm not sure exactly what you want me to answer.
What I'm saying is simple. It's if you take an unwed mother and a dependent child, that is a terrible economic circumstance to start any family formation or any wealth creation.
So then what explains this? That people that have postgraduate degrees, there is almost a 2-to-1 disparity in wealth between black postgraduates and white postgraduates.
Partly as I'm a graduate engineer, I can do math with most people. I would tell you that all charts in the scale charts is suspect.
Well, you can, as I said, you can suspect the data, and I will listen to your perspective respectfully if you provide me with an alternative. Like if you say, well, this data is bogus because it does not agree with my preconceived notions, well, then that's not going to create any dialogue between us. But if you think, well, this data is wrong, and I'm going to show you some other data that reverses this picture or clarifies this picture, I'm open to that conversation.
Are you open to the conversation about unwed mothers?
Sure, why not? But when you look at the question of unwed mothers or single family, a woman raising a child, a dependent child on their own, that is not born out of vacuum either. It is nothing cultural about it that black mothers are more unwed than white mothers. I do not know the data, so don't quote me on the data. I have not looked at the data itself. All I'm saying is that if that is a causal factor, just present the argument. I'm not sure if it is. I've not seen it in any credible studies that is a causal factor. What I'm presenting is what I've seen in economic studies in reputable journals. So if there are alternative ways in which we can explain the data is the data. We can quibble about what the explanation of the data is. We can argue about it, but the data is the data. These are data from federal sources, there are data from state sources, there are data from surveys, and all of them point in the same general direction. That there is a significant disparity between
We've got a couple questions coming up.
between black and white wealth, no matter which way we slice the population, whether we slice it by age, whether we slice it by degree, whether we slice it by income scale itself.
Parmesh, you have the platform and I don't, and I'll ask you one more question, or make a statement and a question. In 1956, about 30% of the blacks were born out of wedlock and around 10% of the whites. Currently, it's about 30% in the white community and about 70% in the black community. I think you can check those facts, you can add it to your barriers to wealth.
But what you're saying, Forrest, I hear you say, is there's something about blackness that causes people not to stay in America.
Listen, I would argue that most people that get pregnant in the black community didn't have any input from the white community.
Let's go with, first Bob. Bob has hand up first after Forrest, then we'll come back to Doug. I know, Bob, you're next. Okay. It's gonna take a second to get you a mic.
Do you have any data that supports the discrimination between ultra wealthy whites versus the low-income middle-class whites? We spent the week looking at 3 billionaires arguing over who's got the best rocket that's going to take people up. What percent are they paying for all of these programs versus we as either middle income or income? I think there's a gross distribution of how the ultra wealthy are being taxed versus how we're being taxed. And why are we focused? It's not a black-white issue. To me, all your charts should be based on wealth. And what percent of the wealth are they paying to support all these programs? It's not black and white.
No, I mean,
Because I feel discriminate as much as anybody else does when I look at one of Bezos or these guys. They're probably paying nothing in taxes relative to their income.
oh, that's exactly the problem.
Well, that's where the money is to fix the problem.
I'm not arguing with it at all, but I'm saying I opened with that slide. When I talk with exactly what you're talking about, this is the general wealth inequality between people at the top of the income scale versus, or the wealth scale, versus people at the bottom. And the disparity is getting worse over time. So it is generally true whether you're white or black. The general statement of wealth inequality increasing between people at the very top, Bezos and others included. Bezos is not in the 1%, he's in the 0.001%.
Then change the tax laws.
Absolutely.
We all believe we should.
Blame me for it.
I'm not blaming anybody. This is
Well, somebody's.
No, I'm not. So let's keep the conversation here because I'm not blaming anybody. I'm saying that we as a society, when we pass laws, when we try to, first of all, let's acknowledge the problem exists. Because part of the challenge that we have is even acknowledging that there is a problem. Like this picture is real. Wealth inequality is getting worse as we progress through time. CEO to worker pay. The ratio between CEO to worker pay in the 60s and 70s, when the middle class was actually growing, was about 30 to 40 to 1. About, let's say, 40 to 1, ballpark. Today it's close to 200 to 1.
But Jeff, you're not going after the 1% of the wealth.
I agree.
Of people.
I agree.
You're going after every white person.
Well, I know that's why Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax plan is something that we should explore. Something that we know that right now there's a tax plan already proposed that would reverse some of the tax cuts that Trump has provided to the very top income levels. 90% of the Trump tax cuts went to the very top of the income scale. People who did not need a tax break got a tax break. So you are actually agreeing with my thesis, and I appreciate that.
Doug? Yeah, Doug, and then. Sorry, John.
Yes, first of all, these I get up early in the morning and turn the TV on for about 10 minutes. I get the 5 a.m. news. And it's headlined, and every day, you know, the police were someplace with a shooting here in Jacksonville. But I think if we could address the murders and the opioid epidemic, I think we would start equalizing opportunity, which is not being, you know, I think the opioid and the murders are concentrated in financially lower income neighborhoods. And it infers that there is depression, there is frustration, et cetera, in those communities. And I think that these issues are tied together, and if they are tied together, for those of us, regardless of which side in this room, we could probably start agreeing on some things that would help in those two.
Yeah, no major disagreement with your thesis that opioid crisis, the pandemic, and just homicides in general have contributed to, but those are just some of the factors. There are additional factors. Climate change is contributing to those. We already have climate refugees happening in this country, and it is contributing to disease and contributing to shortening of life, and that it'll get worse. Those things will get worse. So when we talk about addressing the climate change crisis is not, you know, you look at it two ways. One way, it benefits everybody. The planet is not going to warm as fast. I have a quick slide that I'll show you. It kind of draws attention to climate change crisis. This is not for this presentation, but I was looking at this for another presentation. Just a half a degree change. You know, right now, climate scientists are trying to cap we are in a race against time to cap our increases in temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade. If we lose the race and temperature moves up to 2 degrees centigrade, the planet has warmed about 2 degrees centigrade over the last 30 or 100 years or so. Again, don't quote me on the time. I'm a little bit not sure exactly what is the time length over which that 1.5 degree increase or 2 degree increase happened. But the point of this slide is to show you the delta, the difference between what happens to the planet when half a degree centigrade changes in the surface temperature of the globe. And you can see this. You know, we go from heat waves that are exposing 14% of the global population to heat waves that would expose 37% of the global population. You know, plants would lose life, and butterflies and fisheries and all of the impact. We've seen this happening in Florida already. Huge number of fish dying in the bay, partly related to the excessive warming of the water. So it's not abstract. When we talk about climate change, it's not abstract. It has real changes to people's lives. If we address it, it will help everybody. That's one way to look at it. And a definitely correct way to look at it. But underlying that story is also a story of race. Because the disproportionate impact of climate change, just like the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, was borne by Black and brown communities. It does not take rocket science to figure out why that's the case. So when we address that problem, it addresses the problem for everybody, but it lifts the people, the issue of a racial divide on wealth, on health. You know, for example, in Jacksonville, you can map diabetes rate and heart disease by zip code. No surprises, as I mentioned. If black neighborhoods are 10 degrees warmer than white neighborhoods, no wonder those people living in those neighborhoods will suffer from more diseases. It's just a natural thing that will happen. So, what I mean by that is that at the end of the day, even if we target policies that address racial wealth inequality or racial health inequality, at the end of the day, that same policy is going to benefit every one of us. And that's why I opened with the question, in the we, the people, who is the we? If we believe the we is all Americans, then if some Americans are suffering disproportionately, as an economist, as a person of faith, I can make the moral case why we should help people who are disproportionately affected by these inequalities, whether they're in health or in wealth. But as an economist, this morning, I'm simply trying to make the case that it is economically beneficial if we help people who are disproportionately affected, then it helps all of us. And that is the thesis of this book that I'm recommending some of us, where Heather McKee goes through example after example after example, how, because typically we think of helping poor, helping others as helping the other. You know, almost like a pity. Like they are disadvantaged, if I help them, their health, I feel good about my philanthropic contributions, I'm helping others. What Heather McKee is making the case, by helping others, we're actually helping ourselves. And that's the we talk about. That's the we that's lifted all up. And that is a new approach to thinking. It's an interesting approach. You may disagree with that approach, and I'm open to your disagreements. But when you have a disagreement in that approach, I would like to hear what the alternative is. The data is the data. These are problems. How do we solve the problem?
Jim?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your being here today, Professor. And I'm anxious to hear about critical race theory, which I don't think I've heard about yet. On the other hand, I'd like to just take a second to add some perspective to some of the discussion. First of all, if you don't mind a little crosstalk, Bob questioned the availability of wealth from some of the top wealthy people in the country, and that was referred to in last week's discussion as well. Bob, just to give some perspective, if you confiscated the entire wealth of the Forbes top 400 wealthiest people, wealthiest Americans, you'd have 3.2 trillion. 3.2 trillion wouldn't even make a down payment on what's being discussed currently in Congress to be spent over the next 10 years. So we got to look elsewhere for that. Secondly, I wanted to comment about income. We talked a lot about wealth. The generator of wealth, hopefully, is income. And when you look at income, and I'm going to be quoting here the Economics Daily, which is the federal government publication. Here's really interesting. When I first saw this, I thought, wow, I didn't know that. It is true that blacks or African Americans earn less than almost every other minority except Hispanics. However, it would surprise you to know, and it surprised me to know, that Asians actually earn more, and these are full-time people that are working full-time, so it doesn't include people that don't have a job. But people who are working full-time wage earners, Asians earn more than any other ethnic group. Why is that? They're minorities. And what is it peculiar about blacks versus Asians that makes that income inequality different? Now, if you ask where all that came from, the other one I was surprised to see is one that is Pew Research. Pew Research talks about income inequality among various ethnic groups. And what you see there is between 1970 and 1916, Asian inequality among Asians went from 6.1 to 10.7, inferring that they were able to expand their performance by increasing the top wage earners over that period, whereas both whites and blacks did not change much. The black differential was 9.8 versus 7.8 for whites. So when you look at overall numbers, you come to one conclusion. When you start disaggregating them, you may come to a different conclusion. So I suggest that all of this requires a whole lot more study and thinking to be able to reach a conclusion, which we then can talk about solutions to. The worst thing in the world is to try to answer the wrong question, because you'll never come up with the right answer. That's just my opinion.
No, I mean, no disagreement on your thesis that we need to study this more. And that's precisely what I'm suggesting too. We don't have all the answers, but we have some answers to some questions. And if we cannot help all the people all the time, that does not mean we cannot help some people some of the time. You know, if we cannot solve all of the problems, that does not mean we throw up our hand and say, well, that's the best we can. We cannot solve everything, so let's not try to do something. Now, on your question, one of the questions that you raised about Asian, and I'm Asian. So why do you think that the Asian community does so much better than, let's say, the black community?
They work.
No. The black community works just as hard as the Asian community works.
Cultural issue.
It is not. Asians did not come to this country in chains.
It's not what you.
Asians did not go through Jim Crow. Asians did not go through exclusions and redlining.
They were in camps during the war.
Only the Japanese community, not my community. The South Asian community, when it came, most of us came as highly educated immigrants. Not in chains, not in poverty, not in servitude. And that's the generational wealth divide. You understand as an academic, you very well understand the power of compounding. You start with a divide, and the power of compounding is going to make it worse. So when we ended slavery, what happened to the slaves that were freed? As again, I'm going to quote this from Heather McGhee's book. She makes this point so well, that every progress in this country, you know, the thesis of Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We love to think that it is true, because that's what gives us optimism to fight for change, to make things better for everybody. That is a moral compass that everybody can rally around. But we know that progress is not guaranteed. Just because we want to believe in that axiom, it does not mean progress is guaranteed, and she writes this very well. When the arc in America bends from slavery in the 1860s and returns to convict leasing in 1880s, when it bends from Jim Crow in the 1960s and returns to mass incarcerations in the 1970s, when it bends from indigenous genocide to an epidemic of indigenous suicide, when it bends, but as does a tree in the wind, only to sway back. So we almost swing like a pendulum in this country. We make some changes, then we go back. Then we make some changes, then we go back. So progress is halting. Progress is not linear. Progress is not inevitable. It requires work. It requires thoughtful engagement. So just because, it's not like we eradicated slavery, we abolished slavery, and everything was automatically fine. It was not. So yes, the Asian community has done better, but the Asian community is also a very broadly defined community. It includes people who are with Japanese ancestry, people who are with Filipino ancestry, with Chinese ancestry, Indian ancestry, Pakistani ancestry, Bangladeshi ancestry, Sri Lankan ancestry. It's a very broad, and many of our immigrant story is very different. I came to this country after already receiving a bachelor's degree in engineering. So my progress through life has been significantly different and easier than a person who has lived in generational poverty in an inner city neighborhood.
But we've got several people who are waiting to be called on for the first time. I just want to make one short comment about a book I read, was assigned to us for this very discussion 50 years ago by Theodore Dobzhansky. I don't know if any of you know that name, but the question was about environment or genetics. And the question I have to ask when I see the data on Asians, is there something genetic about an Asian? Are Parvez's genes different from my genes in such a way that he's going to do better in life? Is it genetic? And I'll do the other one, are blacks just genetically different to the extent that they're always going to be slow, dumb, and irresponsible about birth control? I just don't come to that conclusion. I can't. Sue?
Well, I have a comment. First of all, I don't think unwed women who have children, particularly black, are afforded the information on birth control and abortion. And it's also interesting that those who fuss about unwed black women having children are also probably against giving them birth control information and abortion possibilities. Number two, I have a question on giving tax credits for children. How does that affect people in poverty who pay no taxes?
It's difficult. As I said, it's difficult to administer. This child tax credit that has been put together, there are some ways in which even they will be receiving some credit, and I'm a little bit fuzzy on the details on exactly how it will be administered, but this is one of the challenges in administering this idea, this program. So there are, which is why I mentioned the qualifier. If this is implemented well, the child tax credit alone, the $300 child tax credit, is going to cut childhood poverty in half. It is a cause for celebration. That will cut childhood poverty by half. Still does not get us to where we want to. We should eradicate all of child poverty. But does not get us to that point, but it cuts it in half. It's progress. So now let's get back to the drawing board and see exactly the wrestling with the questions you were asking. I'm sure there are solutions to it, but I'm just not a little bit fuzzy on exactly how the federal government is going to administer. And some of the rules are being written.
First of all,
when the law is passed, the exact rules of administering them, it takes a little bit of time to.
Can I talk? Thank you. First of all, I don't know what child property is. Poverty. Poverty. I don't know what it is. But anyhow, just maybe you can answer that at some point. The other question really, or comment that I have here, and I may be wrong, you're asking for solutions. I'm a big believer in the cream rises to the top. No matter where it is and who it is. Those people who are willing to put in the effort, put in the work, rise to the top. You have, to a certain degree, many of the people here in this room rose to the top. I don't know what their backgrounds were, what they got from the government to get where they are, but they got here. And to give people, I'm assuming you're talking about government action here, to do all of these things to help people get to the top. I don't think it's going to work. It's only going to work when people are brought up to think that way and are trained by their parents and people of their friends, and this is the way you succeed. But to make a sweeping statement about what we have to do for all people, it's impossible. You do it one person at a time, but people take their own responsibility for that. That's the way life is.
So how did we
I
end
generally
slavery?
don't agree.
So how did we end slavery except through broad government action?
Say that again.
How did we end slavery? Did we want the slaves to free themselves?
We ended slavery. I wasn't there. I assume it had to do with the
No, neither
Civil
was I,
War.
but I can read history.
Had to do with the Civil War.
Yeah, but it was a government action. The government had to take action to end slavery.
Yes.
How did we get voting rights for every American? Not by somebody saying, well, I just need to vote. The government had to step in and say, we are going to create a law that will allow every American, adult American who is eligible to vote, to vote. You're talking about Bezos went to going a few miles above the atmosphere, and the whole media is going crazy about it, except that 60 years ago, John Glenn did that. He went higher.
Those are
And he did that with
those are different things than what we're talking about.
No,
We're
the argument is that the
talking,
government cannot.
you're talking about wealth. You're talking about wealth, and we're talking about, okay, how do you get there? How do you get to wealth? You're either inherited, or you work your ass off to get there.
Well, some people are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. They didn't work their ass off to get where they are. Trump didn't work his ass off to get where he is. He was simply born in wealth. It's not his hard work that got him wherever he is. In fact, he bankrupted more companies than he ran companies.
He also employed thousands and thousands of people in his businesses.
Yeah, after he inherited $400 million.
Thousands of people.
Yeah, if you give me $400 million in inheritance, I will also employ thousands of people.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
You have a hand here.
Oh, I'm sorry. We've got 4 hands up at the same time. I'm going to go with Scott first, since she's been holding my, and then we're going to come back to Bob.
I'd just like to say that I'm very grateful for my Social Security payment every month. I am delighted that Medicare covers my health insurance. I went to college because I was a war orphan. My father was killed in World War II, and I was able to go to college. I went to Duke, which was even then a relatively expensive school, and it was paid for because I was a war orphan. So I have received my fair share of government help over the years, and I believe it helped me to have a very successful career. I also worked hard, but I had some advantages that plenty of people do not have. And I happen now to volunteer with the program, and I would be happy to take any of you who would like to meet some people who are working very hard, one by one, to overcome the kind of health and education issues that you've seen on this chart. They are starting from way deeper down than I suspect any of us in this room did, although that's probably an unfair assumption. And I don't know anyone in this room who has ever worked any harder than some of those folks do. So I think we need to bear in mind that there are more than one perspective, and it is very dangerous to generalize about people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Bob?
You're an educator,
I am.
and so if you're an educator, then you know a lot about how education affects our whole society at all strata. I don't know why in the areas of the big cities that they have to have such crummy educational systems, K through 12 particularly. And the other thing is that they talked about how you get from here to there. Well, one of the things is, if we don't change our system of allowing people to run our schools no better than what they're doing now, where they sprung CRT on us and we didn't even know it. It had been going on for a few years to many years. Why was that? Why did they hold that? And we didn't find out about it until the pandemic hit us, and we had a different perspective of insights on what was going on. But I can tell you that I was head of the teachers union, local teachers union, or just committee really, in a secondary school, and used to go to the what is it, American Federation of Teachers, or National Education Association, and they would give me all kinds of literature and lectures on what we should be doing. I didn't adopt very many of those at all. What I did was, I went back and I told the teachers on the committee that if we want to have a gain, then we have to frame it on asking for the money extra, but what are we going to give back to them? And so I developed a salary scale that indicated that you could have certain improvements in your salary, but you had to do, I think, about 4 different things to give back to the community and to the students in order to get that kind of raise. And after it was all over, then the school board said we had the best salary schedule in the whole county. It sounds like bragging. I'm not. I'm just saying that because you give back rather than take. And you don't spring things on people like they did the CRT on all of us. And if you want to know why the Asians do so well, we all know why, don't we? Because their family oriented educational priorities are so much higher than most of them, most of any strata other than that here in this country. And so if you don't have those high priorities, one way you're not going to get it is if our unions don't straighten up, then the people in the inner cities particularly are going to fail anyway.
We're actually out of time now.
But I just want to quickly respond.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, but I want to...
I'd like to speak about one program that you mentioned in your list that I know is very successful, and that is in the states where they take the top 10% of the graduating classes from high school and admit them to universities. I know this is very successful in Texas. What my question is, how many states are now doing this kind of thing?
Not a whole lot, not a whole lot. It's just it's a new experimentation. I hope it catches on.
Do we do it in Florida?
No, I don't think so. We do it in Florida. Just one quick response to the comment that you were making, sir, about CRT. Do you know of any high school or middle school or elementary school where CRT is being taught?
I'm not in that realm anymore.
Okay.
I can't give an answer to that, but I do know from reading that in very large numbers.
No, I'm going to cut it short a little bit because I heard your thoughts. I hate to break the news to you. CRT, if your child is learning CRT, you should be congratulating your child because they're ready to get law school admission to the elite law schools in this country. That's where CRT is taught. Critical race theory is not, let me repeat, is not taught in high schools, in middle schools, or elementary school. If anybody is telling you, they're selling you a bill of goods. And you need to go to the source and ask them. Your high schools in your town. Walk up to Ponte Vedra High School, ask them. Walk up to Stanton, ask them, the top high school in the city. Are you teaching CRT? They will ask you and ask, what is that? We don't teach CRT even in colleges. CRT is only is a theory that was developed. The key word is the theory. This is what people do in academia. You look at data. I presented you as an economist. I'm presenting you with data on inequality. Somebody in the legal profession, they look at this data that economists are producing, and what do you think they're asking? They're saying, why? Why after 60 years of past the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, why is there persistent inequality between racial groups? First of all, it's a fair question to ask, And it is certainly within their academic freedom to ask that question. And they answered that question by positing a theory. Again, the key word is a theory. They said, we think, as legal professionalists, as legal scholars, that it roots in some of the systemic challenges in the administration of our laws, in the way some of these laws were conceived. For example, the Social Security Act, that excluded certain workers from participating in the Social Security system. We think that these are the sources of this persistent inequality. Now, you, as a person reading that theory, you can certainly disagree with that perspective. And that's perfectly legitimate. You can find an alternative reasoning. Some of you gave some of these alternative reasonings. I don't agree with your reasoning, but it's an alternative you have posited. But then why ban CRT? Why pass legislation to ban, hold on, sir. Why ban CRT? Because, first of all, you are banning something that is not being taught anywhere in high schools. In Texas, there's a Senate bill in Texas that will ban the teaching of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. That will ban teaching about Susan B. Anthony. Is that where we are as a nation? That we can't teach our children I Have a Dream speech? Is that such a threat to us? And then we want to celebrate Martin Luther King Day?
We're past time, but I think this suggests, as we ask Professor Ahmed to come back, and what I'd like to do at the next time.
By the way, I want to say, even in our disagreements, I enjoy the conversation.
But I think what we need to do the next time is just jump straight to CRT, talk about that, and not all of the context. Although I think this context is hugely important to understand some of the misinformation we're getting about CRT. The more I research it, the more I wonder why I'm researching it. It just isn't happening in our K through 12 schools. But that's another story for another day. Thank you all very much for coming, and Parvez, thank you. Really good.